All right, everybody, welcome to module number 6, Behavior and Conduct Disorders. I hope that you're doing good, and we are now into getting close to about halfway through our class, basically, and so hope you're doing well this semester, finding your way around the classroom and working your way through these different modules. And we come to this very, very interesting module, module number 6, which I always find very, very interesting to talk about and discuss. And what I want to do in this little mini video here at the beginning of the module is just kind of summarize for you some key ideas that I summarize for you in the lecture notes. So here's the thing. Maybe you've heard the term behavior disorder, maybe you have not. But from a psychological perspective, there is this thing called behavior disorders that can apply to both children and also to teenagers and even to adolescents. And maybe you're familiar with that term, maybe you're not. I had never heard that term until I got in college and became a psychology student, a counseling student. This idea of a behavior disorder. Behavior disorder is a very broad term that we use for a person who basically does not learn from their mistakes, has a pattern of antisocial, and the term antisocial here means against society. So antisocial doesn't mean doesn't like to socialize. Antisocial in this context means against society. So a person, whether it's a man or a woman, a child, a teenager, or an adult, who has a persistent pattern of behavior that is against society, breaking the law, violating the rights of other people, destroying property, deceitfulness and theft, patterns of that, almost like a lifestyle, almost like a personality pattern of that, is really what we're talking about with a behavior disorder. Now, I don't know. There may be some of you who are listening to this lecture and you may say, I've never even heard of that. I've never known anyone like that. But maybe others of you are like, well, I do know someone who kind of is like that. We know that there are some kids and adolescents who struggle with what we call conduct and behavior problems. I want to kind of talk a little bit about what that is basically. Now, here's kind of the thing. When we talked about ADHD last time, we talked about how with all, really what's typical for most kids is there are times when most kids will act up and act out. There are times when kids are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They don't follow through on rules or instructions. They don't pay attention. They might struggle in school a little bit. They might be real interested in a video game, but then they ignore you when you're talking to them. And so, that's somewhat typical for a lot of kids. And so with ADHD, for example, we talked about how ADHD is kind of a struggle where what we see patterns of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity that is beyond what we would expect, beyond the typical. So when we talk about ADHD, we're not talking about typical average kiddos. I mean that in a bad way. We're talking about kids who kind of on another level struggle with hyperactive or overactive behavior, impulsive behavior and choices, and poor attention. Same thing is true in this conversation. In some ways, at some level, you remember what it was like when you were a kid or a teenager. Did you do everything you were supposed to do? No, you probably didn't. I didn't either. Were there some times when you broke the rules? Well, I did occasionally. I mean, were there times when you tested limits and tested rules? Yes. Did you may have been gotten in trouble occasionally by a teacher, or may have gotten in trouble, in other areas. I did. I was somewhat of a typical kid and teenager in many, many ways. And that's true really for most kids. My kids were that way when they were when they were young, and teenagers as well. And so we know that that's somewhat typical for just kids developmentally. Kids test limits, and kids oftentimes defy rules. And oftentimes they don't think through their choices. They act impulsively, and they sometimes get in trouble. And at some level, that is somewhat typical to childhood and adolescent development. And we know that that's typical. What we're talking about with behavior disorders is we're talking about kids who are on another level. We're talking about persistent age-inappropriate problems. Persistent, that are somewhat consistent. Age inappropriate means it's the kind of behavior and kind of struggles that we would not expect for a child given their age and their developmental level, where they have problems with following through on rules and behavioral issues. Let me kind of just give you, I give you in the lecture notes 4 or 5 key kind of things that we look for with a behavior disorder. Behavior disorder is a term we use in this case for this class. Let's talk about children and adolescents, where you see an inability, a persistent inability, for example, to learn from their mistakes. The idea is that a typical, healthy, functioning person, whether it's a child, a teenager, or an adult, we ought to be able to, and we should, a healthy person learns from his or her mistakes. Do we make mistakes? Yes, that's not the issue. The issue is, do we continue making the same mistakes over and over and over and over and over again? When we see that, that's when we get a little bit more concerned. And so one of the features or characteristics of a behavior disorder is a child or adolescence where it seems like They just don't, there's like almost like an inability for them to learn from their mistakes. Number two, we see persistent patterns of just a lack of response to negative consequences. So a person who does not fear negative or painful consequences. Again, an average, healthy, typical person, we believe, most of us do not want naturally, we don't seek out negative consequences. That's not natural for most of us as far as a pattern of behavior. But we know that adults, and in this case, children, there are kids, children and adolescents, who it seems like they just don't care. I heard someone say many, many years ago, one of the ways to distinguish a behavior disorder is this. A kid or an adult knows the difference between right and wrong, but they just don't care. See, most of us know the difference between right and wrong, and most of us care. An average person with a healthy sense of conscience and guilt, right? We know the difference between right and wrong. Do we always abide by right and wrong? Not always, but most of us care. A person with a behavior disorder knows the difference between right and wrong, they just don't care. And so this idea of does not fear negative or painful consequences, doesn't try to avoid them, that'll be the second thing. Third thing we see with behavior disorders, it's kind of similar to ADHD. It would be a child or an adolescent that just has this highly impulsive, lack of planning, kind of in the moment, especially when angry, gets angry very, very easily, and then in the moment just kind of goes off, in the moment kind of lashes out without thinking, especially easily agitated, short temper, short attention span, and does not think forward, does not think ahead, highly impulsive, kind of angry kind of behavior, easily agitated kind of thing. Another big thing with a behavior disorder would be a pattern where we see a lack of consciousness or a lack of empathy. Now again, kids have to develop empathy, just like we as adults do. And hopefully as an adult, you have empathy. Empathy means I have the ability to care about other people. I think about other people, not just me. I just don't look at the world from my own perspective. I have some sense of compassion or sympathy, being able to kind of connect with other people. And kids and teenagers with behavior disorders, if you've ever worked with any of kids who have these features, there's like this lack of empathy. They don't care. There's almost like a lack of emotion, a lack of care and concern. They don't care that if their behavior bothers somebody else. They don't. Why would they care? It's kind of the attitude. And I work with many kids who have some of this, who have some behavior disorder kind of features through the years. And oftentimes, their attitude is, why would I care? I mean, I don't care. Why would I care if what I did hurt someone else, or if I got kicked out of school? Why would I care? So sort of that I don't care. All I care about is me. I don't care about you. I don't care about the world. All I care about is me. And so that attitude is this lack of empathy. And then oftentimes we see this overly aggressive and kind of violent or destructive behavior, patterns of that. And so all of those are kind of features of what we call behavior and conduct disorder. So again, patterns of all of those often interwoven with each other. So again, this is another one of those areas of kind of concern or area or disorder, whatever word you want to use, where we have to sort of just look at context. We'll talk more about that in just a second. We have to sort of look at the larger picture before we start saying, well, this kid has a behavior disorder, or this kid's a bad kid, or whatever it may be. So all of those things, overly aggressive, violent, destructive, lack of empathy or pro-social skills or consciousness, highly impulsive, lack of planning and thinking ahead, does not fear or avoid negative or painful consequences, and kind of an inability to learn from their mistakes. That's basically what we're talking about when we talk about behavior disorders. And so the authors of your textbook also do a really, really good job giving you a lot of detail and statistics and background on bullying and parenting styles and culture and ethnicity, all kinds of good stuff. So make sure you read the chapter this week in your textbook, because they give you a lot of good stuff on the behavior disorders. Just real quickly, let me also highlight for you 2 or 3 things I give you in the lecture notes. Number one, I give you a little bit of information this week about juvenile delinquency and gang behavior, mainly because kids with behavior disorders often are in trouble with the law. Now, does that mean that every single kiddo who has a behavior disorder is involved in a gang? No. Not every kid who's involved in a gang has a behavior disorder. But oftentimes we see an overlap. Oftentimes, if you ever work like in community outreach, and you do a lot of work with like teen gangs or young adult gangs, or if you do a lot of work in juvenile detention centers or in juvenile justice and that kind of setting, you're going to work with a lot of kids. Every kid, maybe not every kid, but you're going to work with a lot of kids who have the features of behavior disorders, because kids with behavior disorders, oftentimes because of their behavior, they get in trouble with the law. And so oftentimes there's an overlap between juvenile delinquency and gang-related behavior and conduct and behavior disorder. So I give you a little bit of information in your lecture notes about that. And then I give you two different disorders and diagnoses. We've been talking about, I haven't made a big deal about this, but we've been talking about a lot of different disorders and diagnoses. ADHD is actually a diagnosis. It's an actual diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder is an actual diagnosis. Learning disabilities are actual diagnoses that a licensed clinical psychologist or therapist or psychiatrist can actually give and like assign like a medical diagnosis. Well, there are two behavior disorder diagnoses in the DSM-5, the book that we use, kind of the assessment tool that we use to help us to understand, the symptoms of mental health and emotional and behavioral problems. And I give you a little overview of both of those in the lecture notes. Let me just kind of summarize them for you here just really quickly. Oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, two different things. ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, is the milder of the two, and usually kids with conduct disorder, the more severe. Usually they start out with their behavior usually initially meets the criteria for what's called oppositional defiant disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder is a very, very broad diagnosis that it kind of is what it says it is. It is a pattern of behavior where we see in children and teens where there is persistent, age inappropriate defiance of rules, mild aggression towards people, short temper, kind of a short fuse, lashing out verbally or physically at people, patterns of just arguing for arguing sake, being somewhat attention-seeking, of negative attention, and somewhat manipulative and vindictive of other people when they don't get their way. Lots of passive aggression, and kind of we'll all show you a lot of that kind of stuff. Now, again, some of that we see in lots of different kids. But if you've got a kiddo on your hands, whether you're a parent or a grandparent or a caseworker or whatever, that's just kind of who and how they are. And again, oppositional defiant disorder symptoms can begin as early as 6 and 7 years old. Sometimes it doesn't begin until a little bit later, 10, 11, 12 years old. But persistent patterns over and over again, where again there's just this continual defiance, this continual rule testing, this continual spitefulness and argumentativeness, arguing for arguing's sake, as we sometimes will say in counseling. A kiddo who's got just poor social skills and oftentimes is drawn to kids like them who have a lot of problems. That's one of the things we oftentimes see with behavior disorders, is that kids with behavior disorder traits are not attracted to typical kind of kiddos, kids who don't get in trouble. Kids with behavior disorder traits are almost always attracted to other kids who are getting in trouble. And so it's one of the features that we sometimes see because oftentimes they don't have the social skills to relate to kids who don't want to go out and tear stuff up, and kids who do want to do well and are trying to do well and aren't wanting to get in trouble and have a sense of consciousness. A kid who has a sense of consciousness and empathy is going to be uncomfortable around another kiddo who doesn't, and vice versa. So oppositional defiant disorder is a very, very broad diagnosis that we oftentimes use out there in our world today that I want you to be familiar with. I gave you some symptoms of that. That's the milder of the two. The more severe of the two is what's called conduct disorder. Now, conduct disorder to me is like oppositional defiant disorder plus. So kids with conduct disorder, kids who have the symptoms of conduct, the features of conduct disorder, have everything I just mentioned with oppositional defiant disorder. Short temper, argumentative and defiance, oftentimes blaming others, refusal to take responsibility for themselves, seeking negative, manipulative, spiteful, vengeful, seeking negative attention, poor social skills, all of that plus. Then you get the behavioral issues. So conduct disorder is all of that plus persistent patterns of aggressive behavior towards others, fighting, hurting. It can be animals, hurting animals. It can be hurting others, just picking fights and wanting to fight, overly aggressive. It's the first thing we look for. Second thing, destruction of property, whether it's other people's property, my family's property, whatever. So destruction of property. Usually with conduct disorder, we see patterns of stealing and deceitfulness and just manipulative and lying. Again, kind of chronic lying. And again, usually with behavior disorders, but especially with conduct disorder, maybe you've been around an adult or a kiddo who lies, but it's almost like they don't know they're lying. To them, it's true to them. And so we call a chronic liar, someone who has just sort of that lack of empathy and consciousness And to them, lying becomes just kind of a pattern of just kind of who they are. They don't even know they don't even act like they know that they're lying. They almost like believe it's true. So there's deceitfulness and lying. And then just this idea of law breaking and the idea of violating the rules of society. So usually we diagnose conduct disorder only in situations usually where a kiddo has come to the attention at least once or twice to law enforcement. And so that could be, again, harming other people, stealing from other people, assaulting other people. More often what it is stealing things like stealing cars or property, breaking things, breaking into houses, breaking into cars, taking rocks or whatever and breaking windows just for the thrill of it. So usually with conduct disorder, we see this law enforcement, law breaking thing. And then the key thing with conduct disorder, again, is this lack of empathy. That's a common dynamic that we see really across the board, but especially with conduct disorder, is with kids with conduct disorder oftentimes have almost like this missing piece emotionally and psychologically where they have concern for other people. The only person they care about is themselves. They don't care about the world. They're spiteful and vengeful. They think that they're sort of a victim, right? And they don't care about other people. And so this idea of just a lack of consciousness, a lack of empathy or concern for other people, a lack of guilt, you might say, is another way we sort of see it. So conduct disorder is really the one we see more of that, the law breaking and the lack of empathy and those kinds of things. So oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder almost like on a continuum. The milder one is oppositional defiant disorder. The more severe one is conduct disorder. So go into your lecture notes and read a little bit more about conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. And then just last considerations here before we wrap up this video. So number one, anytime we talk about behavior disorders, it's just as is the case when we talk about other disorders like ADHD, for example. The key phrase is persistent, age inappropriate. Persistent, meaning over and over again, consistency, age inappropriate. So this would be behavior that is consistent or problems that are consistent, and they're just outside the realm of what we consider kind of typical for most kids, and considering the situation and context, right? So again, just because a kiddo's in trouble at school, just because they've spent a night or two in juvenile detention, just because they may have truancy violations or whatever it may be, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have conduct disorder or behavior disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, but it's possible. So we have to just look at this idea of persistent, age inappropriate, really, really important. Second thing that's important anytime you think about the behavior disorder is this. You may remember back from our very first module, we talked about how kids develop in contexts. And what that means is this: environment's always important. Now, environment is always important even with adults. But environment is especially important with kids and teenagers, always, because kids are always living in a home where they're usually being cared for by someone else they should be. So the key thing with in a behavior disorder is you always have to consider environment. So here's what I mean by that. So for example, if I was working and doing an assessment on a kiddo who had some of these behavior disorder concerns, I would want to know a little bit about where they live, who cares for them, and what are those relationships like. Have they had healthy nurturing and stability in their lives? Have they experienced trauma? Have they been abused? Have they been neglected? If the answer is yes, maybe they have been abused, or yes, they have been neglected, or yes, they have experienced trauma, well, then we want to take that into account because that could be what's causing the behavior that we're seeing. So this idea of externalizing an internal struggle. So with kids, we see that sometimes. They have an internal struggle. They've not been cared for, and they externalize it through their behavior. So always taking into account trauma, the possibility of trauma, abuse, neglect, those kind of things. Also the idea of just role modeling is one of the things we want to look at too as well. For example, I've worked with lots of kids who have some of these behavior disorder kinds of problems. And when I got kind of close to them and started doing an assessment on their family, I realized that they had a mother and a father who were also involved in the legal system. They had a mother and a father who had mental health problems or were dealing drugs out of their apartment. And that's what they had been seeing since they were 3 years old. All that they've seen that their mother or dad or boyfriend, whoever, dealing drugs, or maybe they have been taught by role models like older brothers or sisters, gang behavior or whatever it may be. So you always have to consider environment and learned behavior and role modeling. You also have to look at this idea, which the authors of your textbook talk about too, the idea of just family dysfunction and possibility just poor, well, I'll just use the term poor or inconsistent parenting. Because again, although I'm not a believer that every single time a kiddo struggles that it's a family member or a parent's fault, we do see with some of the behavior disorders that one of the reasons why we see the behavior is because discipline has been too harsh, or it has been too lenient, or there hasn't been any at all. Or maybe you have family dysfunction, like the family's going through a divorce, or maybe the mother or the father in the home has a mental illness and or addiction. those kinds of things can come into play. Does that mean a child does not have a behavior disorder? Not necessarily, but just this idea that that's always important to take into account when we think about the behavior of children, adolescents, and behavior disorders. That's just important. And then the last thing is this. Here's another thing I mentioned a minute ago, this idea of externalizing an internal problem. One of the issues we always want to take into account with behavior disorders with kids is this. Is there an underlying mental health condition or substance abuse problem that is making this problem worse or potentially causing the problem? So kids who have bipolar disorder or major depression, for example, kids can experience, teenagers especially, can and do experience the symptoms of bipolar disorder and major depression. And sometimes the way that shows itself is through behavior and behavioral problems. So you always want to take that into account, that oftentimes what we see with behavior disorders is we do oftentimes see comorbidity, we would say, with mental health issues. We also sometimes see comorbidity between behavior disorders and drug and alcohol problems. So again, those are really two separate things, because not every single kid who struggles with addiction is going to struggle with behavioral or conduct problems, not always. But those two things often run together. And so the importance of kind of taking that into account as you're working with a kiddo or looking at a case where you have some behavior disorders and school kinds of problems. When I worked in children's mental health, one of the things that we just always did with every single case that we worked with, because oftentimes what got kids to be referred to us were some of the things we were talking about in this module. They were in trouble with law enforcement. They were in trouble at school. They were fighting. They would not come to school. They were defiant of their parents. And so when we would do assessments, we always just we did like a 360-degree assessment. We looked at the kid's physical, medical history. We looked for substance abuse. We screened for mental health and illness, depression, anxiety. We looked at family systems and family dynamics. We looked at for learning disability. You just have to do that because you want to take everything into account, okay, as you think about behavior disorders. So look at your lecture notes, do your discussion question. As always, you're doing a great job on your discussion questions, by the way. Work on your homework. You're doing a great job on your homework assignments. Take a look at the textbook chapter for this interesting set of problems that we see, and I'll see you next week when we go to our next module. See you then.